Hello there. I hope that you're having a good week so far. We're getting really close to the end of the quarter here with week number 9. So I want to use this week as an opportunity to get at this reading on Gauguin and what it means to make listening accessible. I'm particularly excited to talk about some of the content from this week because my background is in communication and disability. I do a lot of research and work related to the ways in which folks with disabilities use communication and advocate for their needs, including in the context of media, health, and so on. So I'm excited to get into some of the key ideas here and to help to provide context that will guide you through this week's reading. So we'll be talking about elements that make listening accessible, the history and context associated with disability issues, and ways to think about disability more broadly. From my experience, a lot of times, disability studies, disability history is not something that's regularly or often taught. And so I want to use this week's video as a chance to gain some additional context and insight into how we can think about disability and incorporate disability into our own understandings of listening. There are a lot of ways in which disability is incredibly relevant to the listening process and helps us to understand more accessible practices of listening. So this week's reading comes from Professor Gerald Gauguin, who is a scholar at the University of Sydney and is very much concerned with disability rights and activism, focused on many of the ways in which Australia has advanced disability rights, and also concerned with the role of media and the ways in which mediated communication can be made accessible. Additionally, the core argument that's presented in this week's reading, Disability and the Ethics of Listening, is that listening is rarely, if ever, discussed when we think about accessibility. As we've been discussing over the course of the quarter, listening is not something that is typically thought about in much detail. Oftentimes businesses, companies, and so on treat listening as a taken for granted thing that people do. However, in addition to that, when we do start thinking about listening, we don't really think about listening as accessible. For instance, there is an array of experiences that might impact the listening process for accessibility. If listening is a sensory process, if we hear with our ears, see with our eyes, use things such as touch as part of listening too, then differences in terms of how people can access senses or use their different senses to take up information is incredibly important for what it means to listen. So listening needs to be accessible in a variety of different ways. We need to think about what it means to count listening. What does it mean to be a good listener? For example, folks that might be neurodivergent don't necessarily use sustained eye contact, but that doesn't mean that they're not listening. We can also think about, again, sensory inclusion and integration for listening, and who gets access for participation in spaces in which listening occurs too, which is an important consideration that I'll get to in a little bit more in just a moment. So I think one of the most important things for us to start out with is defining and explaining what disability is. Because when we use a definition of disability, there's a few things that might immediately come to mind. We might think about the wheelchair symbol that's used to indicate accessible parking spaces or placards. We might think about somebody in a wheelchair, somebody in crutches, or we might think about this as older folks in mental health facilities, or we might associate it with young people who have differences developmentally. However, disability covers an incredibly wide range of human experiences. For instance, an estimated 20% of the population in the United States has a disability, according to the CDC. Disabilities in many cases are not necessarily visible. They can be mental, behavioral, cognitive, or they can be things that are not always seen or understood by the broader public. For instance, autoimmune conditions. So disability is an incredibly important and also at times hidden aspect of lived experience. Some have called disability the largest minority in the United States. I have some issues with that kind of framing as a way to describe disability, but it's clear that that's experienced by a wide array of individuals. And as the disability scholar and writer, Rosemary Garland Thompson likes to say, just about every one of us has had some type of experience with disability in our lifetime. That is, Compared to things such as race, ethnicity, and so on, disability is something that we oftentimes find ourselves in and out of if we're not somebody that lives with or experiences disability regularly in our lives. For instance, if you found yourself getting sick, including feelings of the impacts of COVID-19, if you found yourself with a major injury, like an athletic injury, you've experienced some of the impacts and issues related to disability. And additionally, as mentioned before, a significant portion of disabilities are invisible or intermittently visible for folks with chronic health or other related conditions. We also know that disability has had some major issues related to COVID-19, that individuals who are considered immunocompromised or have a disability or experience that impacts their ability to have and build an immune system have been at a greater risk with COVID-19 and some of its negative effects. We also can understand that disability is this sort of historically contextual and changing phenomenon. One thing to know in terms of disability and terminology too, is that individuals based on their own experience might prefer to use person first language, person with disability, while others might prefer to use identity first language or disabled person. So the best framework to do is to respect the way in which somebody wants to describe themselves. For instance, if somebody has a health condition or chronic headaches or migraines, right, they might say that I'm a person with disability. And by saying that, right, they're centering sort of who they are and seeing disability as very much outside of that. However, for folks, for instance, members of the deaf community or members of the autistic community, identity first language is more popular because folks see that as a core element of who they are, that there's not a person that exists external to their disability, but to be a deaf person or an autistic person is a core part of who they are and how they engage with the world. For them, saying I'm a person with a disability is somewhat similar to, on the basis of race, saying, oh yes, I'm a person with Black rather than a Black person, right? So some of the ways that people use that terminology differently is just an important consideration. And I'll be using those terms interchangeably for today. One, I think, important thing to think about when we're defining and explaining disability is understanding the evolution of the medical to the social model. So when we think about disability, it's very common for us to approach it from a kind of medical perspective that's emerged over the last several decades as we've seen advances in medicine and technology. And under the medical model of disability, it suggests that the individual is the person that has a sort of impairment or issue that prevents them from reaching what is seen as the sort of ideal body or way of being. That oftentimes, right, if you're at the doctor and you're seeing a poster on the wall of how people should be or what it means to be a healthy person, that if you're feeling like chronic pain or you have some level of developmental difference or experience, that you experience a problem or issue outside of that ideal. And there's a lot of contexts in which a medical approach can be useful, right? If you find yourself having a seizure and you need medical support, absolutely, that's an issue that needs to be resolved or to be dealt with. The problem with the medical model is that it assumes that the person is sort of responsible for or should be the thing that's fixed in situations that are not necessarily appropriate to focus on the individual or the issues that the individual has. Instead, to focus on some of these societal barriers or issues that create disability. That is, the social model suggests that while certainly we experience differences in terms of accessibility, in terms of our body, in terms of our experience, that society is in essence creating disabling barriers that make our participation and ability to act as autonomous people more difficult. For instance, if you go to a building and the building only has stairs and doesn't have an elevator, right? It's not compliant with the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act. That's an example of the social model at play. People in wheelchairs could not go up the stairs or not be able to access that space. So similarly, the social model suggests that we should do corrective measures that are designed to make the world more accessible. For instance, using curb cutting on the corners of roads, creating a ramp so that people can go up the ramp and access the sidewalk, is one such model of using the social approach to make greater accessibility. Medical model focuses on the individual as in need of fixing. Social model focuses on the barriers created through society and tries to incorporate a greater variety of perspectives into the occasion. I think it's also worth adding some context regarding disability history in the United States. If you haven't already seen it and you're interested in understanding a little bit more about disability history, I would highly, highly recommend that you watch the Netflix documentary Crip Camp. It's a great sort of overview of Camp Jened and more broadly into looking at disability history in the United States. It's a great watch. Some of the highlights and things to know regarding disability history is that we have honestly not reached a space of accessibility until fairly recently. In fact, if we go all the way back to the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, and the ending of racial segregation, we know that this set the scene for ending segregation more broadly as it related to disability issues. While we still see things like special education classrooms or designated settings, there was a greater sort of emphasis on institutionalization and barriers that impacted people with disabilities. One of the other major advances that we saw came in 1973, in which Section 504, or a section of the Rehabilitation Act, actually included a component that was designed to prevent disability discrimination in the workplace. However, that section wasn't actually implemented or put into practice, and it was only after a series of protests, including Capitol sit-in and really intense sort of confrontation with political leaders that it actually got implemented. But perhaps the major kind of landmark case that set the scene for where we are now in terms of disability and accessibility is the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, signed here on the right by George H.W. Bush. And the ADA was designed to provide reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability. And this is the model that in the US, we in many ways follow to this day. So the ADA is seen in a lot of different settings. For instance, if you've ever applied for a job and it says that you can't discriminate or you're not going to make somebody less likely to be hired because of disability, that's the ADA. If you've ever sought an accommodation for any class and worked with the Disability Services Office, that is also using the ADA to provide formal accommodations and to ensure that classes are made accessible. So all of these things put together are examples of how the history of disability activism, protest, and so on has sort of mapped out where we are now. One example of this and the way in which a sort of listenable environment or activism was used was with the 1990 Capitol Crawl. So pictured here on the right are a series of people with disabilities who got out of wheelchairs or crutches and physically crawled up the steps of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And this was used to highlight accessibility barriers, problems, and issues facing people with disabilities who didn't have access to accommodations or to support. So to highlight that inaccessibility and to push passage of the ADA, the Capitol Crawl was done and shows us the ways in which different methods of speaking and engaging, using physical bodies as a way to highlight inaccessibility served as a really important element of how to create more accessible communication. So there's a variety of different ways, as suggested in this article, that disability can connect to listening. That is, that people can benefit from direct listening to people with disabilities, that including disability perspectives and experiences in the conversation is incredibly important. The assumption that people might not be listening if they're not giving eye contact, if they appear to be sort of doing sort of behaviors designed to help them to function in a disabling world, are not necessarily signs that somebody's not listening, but they're listening differently, using things such as lip reading or the usage of American Sign Language. And that disability invites new methods of listening and engagement. For instance, ASL in the United States actually involves a variety of different accents and ways of speaking that could be heard or listened to by people that are familiar with ASL. Pictured here is Christopher Newell, who is referenced in this week's article as a major disability activist and voice, who was sort of a landmark figure in developing the social model of disability that we've been talking about a little bit for today. A couple other things to note here. One major element is expertise, right? The idea that oftentimes folks with disabilities encounter situations in which they are told that they are not the expert of their own body, or that there's somebody else, for instance, a medical expert, who themselves should be the expert or the person that is referred to as an authority on the matter. And what we know in a practical context is that that's not necessarily the case, that people oftentimes, through their lived experience and feeling in that body, find themselves as experts or able to really understand issues in a unique way. So one way we can become more thoughtful and considerate listeners is to think about how the expertise of lived experience plays into our lives. Another idea that's used by a lot of disability activist organizations, including the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, is the quotation, "Nothing about us without us." That oftentimes in the context of disability, there have been many situations in which non-disabled people, such as parents or medical experts and so on, are making decisions that are about or implicate or assume disabled experience. So listening means really incorporating and including voices in a way that avoids the sort of detached or perhaps disrespectful approach that might be taken. Additionally, that disability has issues related to partial and selective listening, that we need to think about these different experiences as it relates, and that we oftentimes do not necessarily give full attention or respect for people that come from disability perspectives. So accessible listening, right, creating a good environment in which we can listen and understand messages, involves rejecting the binary that somebody is either listening or they're not. You have to redefine that in new ways. It means creating sensory and accessible inclusion. So my partner's work is in nonprofit management, and recently she began to add ASL interpretation to regular weekly meetings. And as a result of that, saw an increase of participation of folks that are deaf in those meetings, and also people that were better able to access archives and understand what was going on in previous meetings. So creating a listenable environment using things like active and empathetic listening is only possible when we're making that listening accessible. And then also opening up the opportunity for listening to be understood or counted for in different ways. So to wrap up some of the key points from this week, we will use these last 2 weeks to catch up on some major assignments for the course. We've talked a bit about how disability and its models, the social and medical model, and its ways of thinking are historically situated, and how this week's reading looks at the idea of creating accessible and listenable messages in new ways. For next week, our final week of the course, we'll be discussing the limits of listening. We've been talking a lot about the ways that listening can be great and an excellent resource, but listening is not, a cure-all for all the problems that we face in the world. We can look to the recent challenges with Russia and Ukraine as an example of the ways in which listening does not always get to the heart of social problems. So we'll look at some of the limits and potential setbacks of listening as well for next week. Have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to sharing the final video with you next week.